All right, I think we'll get this thing started. I guess the mayor is in the building, but he is not here. But I'm sure he'll join us. So, thanks for coming today. Should be a good discussion. Um, this is really a direct result of the downtown framework plan. We saw how well that went. Um, the outputs or the final results were that were to have a playbook of downtown, identify streets for various modes of travel. So when MetroCog was asking for project ideas, Aaron Nelson and I put this concept out there. Hey, let's. We've always had the long range plan, which is so high elevation you really don't get into the weeds. Hey, let's move this playbook system wide, so we can go through a process, inform all the elected folks how we do things on an annual basis. We've seen that we come in front of you quite probably too many times where we ask you to make a decision on a certain corridor. I've been here 17 years, and every time we come up to you guys, there's a lot of fresh questions on corridors when we're asking you to make the final answer. So we thought we'd step back and hey, let's look at our system as a whole. There's a lot of gaps. There's a lot of opportunities. Um, let's study this and let's make a plan going forward. So that's how we got here. Um, MetroCog put out an RFP this winter, spring, and we selected Kimberly Horn with a sub-consultant, Bolton and Mink. So Lydia Stats is project manager. She's going to go over probably 30 minutes of a presentation, and then it's going to be a little interactive. I think she's got some polling gadgets for you guys to do. So I just want to thank you for coming, and we'll get into it, and then it should be a good discussion. It's all
Awesome.
yours.
Great. You guys hear me all right? Okay. Yeah, like you said, my name's Lydia Stotts from Kimley Horn in our St. Paul office. Drove up here early this morning and glad to be here. This is my coworker, Joe Lampy, who's been helping me out on this project. Happy to be here in front of you guys today to give you a little bit of background on kind of this project, where we are, what's been done so far, what we're hoping to get out of it. Talk a little bit about the approach that we're taking to planning. So like Jeremy said, hoping to kind of change the approach that's been happening in the city historically to kind of have a new approach going forward in terms of how we design corridors. Talk a little bit about the technical work we've done, the multimodal needs assessment, and kind of what that's been telling us so far, as well as go through some of the street design framework, so how we're thinking about street design, some of the policy opportunities we see in terms of changing how we do things and how we do planning at the city. And then we'll just talk about next steps, kind of what's coming up. So I'm going to walk you through this. We are going to go through quite a bit of information. Might be best if you kind of hold questions till the end, because I might answer it, in 2 slides or something like that. But happy to have a discussion about anything that you see or have questions on. So a little bit of background on this, with Jeremy kind of teed up a little bit. Why do another plan, right? We've got a lot of transportation plans in the city, and we got some great ones too. Some relatively recent ones that you can see here is the Go Fargo 2030, the comprehensive plan, which is obviously a comprehensive plan for the whole city, but includes a pretty good transportation chapter that outlines the vision. There's the Downtown in Focus playbook that Jeremy referenced, which gives detailed design guidance for downtown. There's the Core Neighborhoods plan, which also gets into the transportation vision. And then there's the Fargo West Fargo Parking and Access Study pretty recently, which went through another kind of design exercise. However, what we also know is that coming up, the city's going to undertake a land use plan and land development code update. Transportation and land use, we know, are inextricably linked, right? You need to have your development code in line with your transportation vision, and your transportation vision in line with what your development code's trying to say, in order for both of your visions, the development vision and the transportation vision for the city, to kind of align and come true. So the city realized that there's a missing middle in there, right? For a citywide transportation plan to really outline the transportation vision, inform our land use plan, and really put together some concrete implementable steps in order to align the two and make sure that everything is coming together and all the puzzle pieces fit. So that middle box right there, the policy design and implementation guidance, is really where this plan fits. It builds on all those other plans, doesn't throw them out. We're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We're building on all of the great work that's been done and looking forward to what can we do to inform the next steps. So like I said, so what are we planning, or what are we hoping to get out of this plan? Like I said on the left there, this plan will build on past plans, right? We're not starting over, we're not scrapping everything, taking a look at what's been done and how can we build on that to move forward. It's also going to evaluate the city's current implementation processes and identify adaptations. So in other words, are there ways that we could be getting more done and implementing more of the projects that we want to? Also identify some of those next steps to translate the transportation vision into reality. So what are some concrete steps we can take this year, within 5 years, within 10 years, to set us up for success? And then integrate with other major planning processes like you just saw, the land development code and a comprehensive plan upcoming. How can this plan kind of inform those and set up a flexible framework for when we get there? We're also going to get several deliverables out of this plan, including 2 that we brought with today. You're welcome to have a copy of. The foundations report, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is kind of the, actually I'll go through what those are in a little bit, but we've done the foundations report and the multimodal assessment. Upcoming still are some concrete policy recommendations. So in other words, how can our processes and programs change? How should we be adapting? A roadway playbook, which is kind of what Jeremy was talking about, concrete design guidance citywide, so that when projects come up, we can take a look at this playbook and determine exactly what we said in 2021 this city should be or this corridor should be when it grows up. Some street design guidelines to inform generally how we think about street design, what's important to us in terms of multimodal facilities and how people interact with the street. And then an action plan, a way to put all of it together into kind of a roadmap, so to speak, in terms of how do we follow all these things and what should we be doing from now through the next decade. So how will we get there? This is kind of we're probably towards the end of phase 2 there, roughly halfway through the process. In other words, we've set up the foundations, done kind of our upfront research and researched the goals, that sort of thing. Now we're looking at policy and mobility integration, so putting together all of our recommendations into some concrete kind of integrated steps. Next phase will be kind of putting all this together into that action plan that we talked about, and then finally the approval phase, putting it all together into a nice playbook, a nice plan that this body will adopt and say that this is what we want for the city. The plan goals. So these should look pretty familiar to you. There's probably nothing here that you haven't seen before. To start off this process, we set up 6 basic goals that are driving the rest of this process. And these plan goals you may not have seen put together in this way before, but how we determined them was by going through all the previous plans that we just kind of looked at to see what were their goals. How can we distill these down into kind of 6 statements about what's important to Fargo, as well as conversations with city staff about, what's the feeling right now? What do we need to be looking at? So our 6 goals right now really take kind of a holistic view of mobility. Building on some of those other projects, in other words, safety. Safety is always number 1. We know that safety's always got to be a top goal. Innovative projects. What can we build on in terms of best practices from other places that have been doing things what practices should we be bringing to Fargo? Advancing our complete streets. You guys have a complete streets ordinance, or a complete streets policy, sorry, it's not an ordinance. What can we be doing to kind of advance that policy throughout the city? Improving our access to opportunity. So in other words, improving the number of jobs, clinics, schools, destinations, shopping, that sort of thing that everyone can access, even if they don't have a vehicle, right? What can you drive, walk, take the bus to, that sort of thing. Improve connectivity for all modes. So like we just talked about there, not necessarily just thinking about driving anymore, but how can we ensure that if you don't own a car, that you can still get anywhere in the city on a complete network. And then life cycle sustainability. How do we think about funding, managing, and ensuring that what we're doing today is going to be sustainable into the future? So what have we done so far? I told you we'd get to this point. There's 2 reports that have come out so far. The first one is this foundations report, which sets us up for what is the vision and how are we going to undertake the rest of this process. It was a concrete plan review of all the previous plans that the city has done, at least in the past decade, that kind of included a transportation vision, make sure we're not missing something that was really important there. A review of some of the socio-demographic trends that are driving the city, because we know Fargo is a very fast-growing place and that it's not going to look the same in 10 years as it does today. It doesn't look the same today as it did 10 years ago. So what does that mean for transportation? And then policy considerations, getting a little bit into kind of what are some of the challenges with how we're operating right now and what are some of the opportunities to change that. The second phase of that report was a multimodal assessment. So it's a little bit more of a technical assessment of what's on the ground today, what are our challenges when it comes to infrastructure, and what can we do about that. So as a transportation inventory, in other words, what is the state of our facilities? How many miles of sidewalk do we have? How many miles of bike facilities? Where are they? Some safety trends, taking a look at the crash rates. Where are our highest crash intersections and our highest crash corridors? Where are pedestrians and bicyclists being hit? That sort of thing. As well as a multimodal level of service, which we're going to explain in a little bit more detail in a couple slides here, but really taking another, expanding the way that we usually think about how well our transportation system is performing to think about all modes and level of comfort for all people who are traveling. And what have we learned? There's a lot more in these reports, but I'll give you the cliff notes right here. Number one, Fargo is growing, right? You guys are very familiar with this by now. That graph on the right there shows not only kind of the astronomical growth of the last couple decades, but that it's expected to continue into the future based on some regional trends and regional projections. So that means that the challenges we're having today are only going to grow unless we plan ahead, right? We can't just sit here and do things the way we've always done and expect things to get better. The other thing is multimodal options are limited. So in other words, if you don't drive, it's a little bit difficult to get around the city. There's a lot of barriers there in terms of wide roads without crossings. There's a lot of safety issues. It's a little bit difficult. There's a disconnected network there that makes it difficult to get around. And to overcome these barriers, there needs to be a focused effort to really reconstruct or install some innovative solutions in some areas. In other words, we can't just sit there and expect these problems to go away. We've got to really think about how we're going to overcome these barriers. The other main takeaway there is right now, the way we think about transportation and land use in the city are kind of disconnected, right? We need a way of kind of connecting the two and putting together some context-sensitive design standards that create more complete neighborhoods. In other words, and we'll get into this in a couple slides too, but cities, or not all streets should look the same. A residential street serving an elementary school or a library should probably have a different look and feel and design than an arterial roadway that's taking people to and from the grocery store or to a major office park, right? So thinking about how we kind of set up a decision framework for that. And the other thing I'll highlight here is these two numbers on the side that kind of highlight an opportunity. Fargo has a very short mean commute time today. In other words, the average commute time when you average out all the commuters in the city of 15.3 minutes. That's how long it takes people on average to get to and from work. The national average is more like 23 or 25 minutes. I have to look at the exact number. 87% of those people also commute less than 10 miles, which again is very short compared to the national average. All of that shows that there's a great opportunity there. We know that those short commutes have great potential to shift modes, right? To either be, if there's a bus network that is fully functional and takes you to all your destinations, a 15-minute commute is totally doable by bus. Less than 10 miles, if you're a fit person, if you're comfortable with it, a lot of people might try to bike that. There's a huge opportunity there to kind of shift modes in the future and get people off their cars. Every car we know that's off the road improves congestion, improves our street operations, improves opportunities for everyone. So that's just highlighting some of the opportunities.
Can I interrupt with a quick question there? Do you have those numbers for cities that are of comparable size?
I don't have them in front of me, but they're very easy to get. It's all U.S. Census data, so it's available for anywhere. Yeah, but we absolutely could if you wanted to do a little comparison.
Yeah, so and as part of this process, looking at new ways to approach analyses to make sense of what's going on in Fargo. And as Lydia mentioned previously, this process is looking at multimodal level of service. So for the non-planners in the room, the jargon here, level of service is a historical measure of how well, you can see on the left here, the vehicular chart, how well is a roadway performing. We have, level F on the bottom, all the way up to level A, and essentially this is a composition of the roadway vehicle volumes with the capacity or how many lanes there are. And so as part of this, wanting to look at other modes besides vehicles, there has to be a new approach because you can't just look at vehicle miles traveled for bikes and peds and transit. So this process is taking into consideration these other modes, and we can get into this a little bit later, but if you look at the ped, bike, and transit level of service, it takes things into consideration such as cyclist comfort, roadway degradation, the number of heavy commercial vehicles in place. So it's a slightly different analysis than it would be just for the vehicular level of service, but it's important to consider that as part of this transportation plan. Next slide. And adding on some data onto that information. So if you see on the chart here, this our subconsultant Bolton and Mink performed this multimodal assessment, and what we can see is on the far left, how are vehicles, the vehicle infrastructure faring in Fargo, and how are the pedestrians and bike and transit infrastructure faring as well. And so when we look at it from a citywide level, the vehicles and the pedestrian infrastructure is performing very well, a level of service between levels A and C. And as we get to look at bike and transit, faring a little bit worse in terms of comfort or just performance overall. And what we wanted to do is highlight on the right there, looking at the past 4 years of bike and pedestrian incidents, the fact that only 5% of bike and ped crashes did not result in an injury or a death. And so when we think about how, do vehicular and other modes of transportation interact with each other, that's very important to understand that when we're looking at providing for bike and ped and transit infrastructure, that there are ways to reduce fatalities and injuries overall on top of overall incidents.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in as well and point out that that pedestrian level there looks pretty good right now, right? There's about 87%, I think it is, of our streets that are covered by a sidewalk network. But that's where I think the opportunity lies. Just because there's a sidewalk there doesn't necessarily mean it's safe or comfortable to use, and that's where these safety statistics really come into play. I think is that when you really get down into it, there may be a sidewalk there, but there may also be a lot of crashes happening in the crosswalks that connect those two sidewalks and that sort of thing. So really, I think the key for the bicycle and pedestrian data is the crash rates.
Yep. Painting the overall picture. And so again, looking at a new approach of how we're investigating this, like Lydia mentioned previously, we wanted to center on land use and center on the context within the city. So performing this context-sensitive design guidelines, focusing on what is the look and feel of the neighborhood or the area of town as opposed to what its roadway designation is. And when I say roadway designation, we're talking about the arterial roadway, the local roadway, and that goes back to that vehicular level of service. And so it acknowledges the different needs in the different areas of that specific roadway. And what we wanted to do is paint a picture on the right here of, well, what is an arterial roadway? How can the look and feel and function change throughout the city? So on the top, we have what could an arterial roadway look like in a core neighborhood where it's a little bit more compact. There's larger sidewalk space. There's only 2 lanes of traffic, all the way down to the mixed use area where you do have that sidewalk space. You have some bike and pedestrian facilities as well as a mixed use roadway. So it just shows that within one, and we can imagine within the city of Fargo, there might be one arterial roadway that you can imagine that could, the functionality is not the same from north to south or east to west throughout the entire corridor. So that's kind of, and we'll get to this in a second, but in the street design guidelines, this is plays a key role in that, understanding what the use of the land use and the context is of the area of the city. And so putting this together from sort of like a toolbox perspective, reviewing what we just covered, when we're looking at a potential project or a potential revamp of a specific roadway or a transportation infrastructure in general, we'll first want to look at, well, what is the development context? And by that, meaning, is it a residential area? Is it a mixed use area? Is it a commercial area? We take that into consideration. And then we look at what is the roadway type? What is the vehicular volume? Are there any other considerations for other modes? We'll take that in consideration. And then the operational characteristics, knowing that throughout a specific corridor, throughout the city, there are these niche uses or functions. There might be a specific business that provides extra traffic in one area than the other. So we want to take that into consideration as well to get us to, well, what could this guideline look like? And we provided some example cross sections that provide this guidance in a more specific way of, well, what are our goals? What are we really looking to get out of this? But it takes into consideration these multiple levels of viewpoints, essentially, to the street level guidance. And so an example of this in this toolbox would be in a mixed use collector area. So mixed use is the design context, the collector is the roadway type. We're providing flexibility in terms of how a potential upgrade could look. So not just one be-all solution. And so that's what you're seeing on the right of the screen, where there's two different options. And so guiding these two images are the specific design characteristics of the area, the access management, the vehicular access management, the pedestrian access management, other special considerations, along with the level of service and the multimodal level of service goals for that specific section of the corridor, again, to get you to these two different look and feels of the roadway. They're both in a mixed use area, they're both on a collector, but again, it's providing some flexibility in terms of the image on the top is, there's some parking on the side with some bike facilities and 2 lanes of travel in the middle versus a more protected, green median in the middle. And it's all kind of getting to the ultimate level of service goals, safety goals that Lydia mentioned previously. But in a concrete way that it's guiding these decisions in an analytical way.
Dumb question, but I see people, I see trees, I see bikes. Is that a fence that I see next?
To the bicyclist?
Yeah.
That would essentially be, it's kind of like a cross-cut of what would that look like if you're looking down the road. So that's kind of like a bollard or a protected, a non-permanent
Like the
plastic bollard.
plastic poles that you sometimes see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
And another option there, I should say too, is if you remove those bollards but still have the painted buffer, you see that one has kind of a wider painted buffer. That adds a little bit extra protection too. So,
and again, this is just an example. So we have, whether it's combinations of the context development type, this mixed use, versus the roadway type collector. And when you blend those together, right, you might have a residential local street. Will look different than what we're showing in this example now because of its purpose, its the number of vehicles, and like how many bicyclists and pedestrians are using that area versus a denser mixed-use collector area with a larger, wider roadway with more vehicular traffic. So again, there's more of a playbook style of guiding a decision based on, again, these two things of what's the roadway type and what's the land use design context.
and I should just note that level of service goal you see there at the bottom too. What Joe just talked about, that multimodal level of service really guides the design of the street. So in other words, if you see here, and this is just an example, on a mixed-use collector type street, maybe we've decided that we want pedestrians and bicycles to be really comfortable and to be the priority. So in other words, we're going to shoot for a design that would give a level of comfort A or B for those two modes. Maybe we decide in this area, vehicle operations aren't the most important. You know what I mean? We want to serve the businesses and we really want it to be walkable and bikeable. So in other words, we don't want to, totally forget about it, but maybe a C is fine. We don't have to shoot for a level of service A on every road when it comes to vehicles. And that's really that framework you see there in terms of how does it guide the design.
Yeah, and again, if this is in a commercial area with a lot of larger 18-wheel trucks, like Lydia mentioned, maybe there is not the need for such robust pedestrian or bicycle infrastructure to potentially to provide that on a parallel roadway, but not in a commercial park or somewhere where we have a lot of truck movements.
So it's the land use that surrounds the street that determines the length, the level of service goal, and or whether it's categorized as a collector or not. Or
That's right.
whatever.
Land use would be the primary consideration,
Okay.
and then followed by the street type.
Yeah.
And then any special operational, like is it a one-way street? Does it serve a park or a special destination or something like that?
Yeah, and maybe in a simplified way to put it too is if you have two different maps and you can overlay those together of, well, what are we have arterials, collectors, local streets on top of the land use, and so that kind of triangulates what we're talking about, but as well, understanding that not every area of the city is going to be the same, and so this provides a wide range of guidance, but in that arrow graphic that I was showing before, there are these other special considerations. So maybe in a mixed-use collector area, these are these goals, but maybe in another specific area closer to a school, closer to the university, maybe the bike ped goal would be amped up a little bit to make sure that based on the use of the folks that are in that area.
Okay. There's a lot to digest. Happy to answer any questions, but And now I'm going to move us into the policy modernization part of this. So there's kind of two different parts of this project. One is how we design our streets and what they look like. And the other is policy, programs, that sort of thing. How are we doing today? How are we essentially working in terms of planning and transportation engineering, and how could that change?
So just one question. We had a great debate about the bike lanes coming from the university to downtown.
Okay.
They've been sitting there, and that'll be historic. That's what we did. Will you analyze if that really worked? We had great debate on the commission whether that was workable, non-workable. Are they using it? Is the best use to it? And some people even wanted that moved to a different street. So will part of your analysis go into, yeah, it's looked like it worked good, and we think it should be transferred elsewhere in the city?
Yeah, we haven't gotten down to that level of detail yet. That is kind of the next step of this, but we will be looking at, there are 10 specific corridors that we're going to kind of zoom in on and do a specific kind of analysis. What should this look like? Is the design working now? That can certainly be one of them if that's an area we want to look at. The other streets, because like I said, there'll be, just because, it takes time to specifically analyze and design every street. So other streets in the city will get a more programmatic type of, the framework that we just looked at. But we are going to be looking at some specific corridors and providing specific recommendations.
If I could just add to that, because I think the current situation, and it sounds like most of your data is related to current experience, whether it's pedestrians or bicyclists, have decided not to go on these streets that feel unsafe.
Yeah.
So how do you project forward for something that might be different?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's something we run into a lot, right? Is that if you look at how many people are biking and walking in Fargo today, it's not very many. But we know that it's kind of a chicken or the egg situation, right? A lot of people aren't biking because they don't feel safe, because people don't see people biking. They say, well, we don't need all these bike lanes and stuff. So it's a chicken or the egg, because if you provide those safe facilities, a lot of people are surprised by how many people use them and how many people, use them not just for recreation, but to get to and from their destinations. So it's always difficult to project, especially in a place like this that's so seasonal. And, those people who might make great use of the bike lanes on a beautiful day in September, you might not see anybody out there on a windy day in February. But there are some good kind of case studies out there in terms of, how much of an increase you can expect to see for each additional mile of specific facilities and that sort of thing. So while it's difficult to project specific numbers, we definitely do know based on case studies and what we've seen around the country that there's definitely a relationship there. All right, get rid of that. Okay, so this next part, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit more about our policies and practices. We did a little exercise at the beginning of this, which was interviews sitting down with the planning department, public works, and engineering, and just kind of talking through each, what are your challenges? What would you like to see happen? What do you need to get out of this plan? And we did each department individually. And then what we did was we brought all of our notes together, and we found out that there are many, many shared challenges, along with some department-specific concerns. But we came up with a couple of different opportunities that we think address a lot of these challenges that we're seeing. I'm just going to go through a couple of them at a pretty high level now. But one of the main opportunities, and there's actually 3 here in this slide, the main opportunity that we think there's time to take advantage of is to align with the land use code, which we know is coming up hopefully next year. And a couple different ways to do that. There's several different policies that we can adopt into our land use code that have an impact on transportation and kind of vice versa. One would be a formal connectivity policy for new developments. And this can look a number of different ways. So in other words, there are ways to measure the connectedness of the street grid, which we know has a huge influence. If you look at those 2 diagrams on the right, that A and B are the same distance apart, but it's much easier to get there and much quicker if you're in a grid-like network on the bottom versus if you're in kind of cul-de-sacville there. You keep running into dead ends and have to take detours. And there are ways to measure this and ways to kind of encode this into your development plans to say you need to be provide at least this many connections. You can also adopt guidelines and design standards governing private roadways. That was a concern we heard a lot in terms of wanting to make sure that all streets in the city, regardless of if they're public or private, are conforming to the same standards. So there's certain guidelines and policies that other cities in the country have adopted that we can look to, as well as adopting these context-sensitive design standards that we just talked about, including a multimodal level of service goal for each context area. In other words, formalizing that and putting in your document, we want our streets to look this way in these certain areas and in these situations. There's also ways to modernize your current complete streets policy, which was adopted in, I might get the year wrong, I think it was about 2010. It's at least a decade old now. And there's been a lot of good research and a lot of advances in terms of how to implement a complete streets policy and ways to kind of tweak that. One of the ways is, and as you can see, there's a lot of great national best practice research by a group called the National Complete Streets Coalition that we would look to for guidance. And one of these ways is checklists. So in other words, if you're doing a street project, make sure that you go through this complete streets checklist to make sure you're doing everything you should and could be under the complete streets policy. We've helped other cities adopt this type of checklist, and it really aids in implementation because it kind of takes doesn't take the thinking out of it, but it makes it more automatic that you have to look at all these things. There's also ways to just improve the transparency and make sure that we're really taking a hard look at what we're doing to see if it's working. So in other words, developing a report card to measure performance against our transportation goals. A lot of cities do this and put it right online. So in other words, adopt some metrics that say, here's what our crash rate is today. Here's what we want it to be in 10 years. And then take a regular look and see how you're advancing towards that goal. Same thing with maybe today we have X number of miles of bike lanes. In 10 years, we want to have this many miles. And then put out a report card regularly to show how you're doing. And if you're not meeting those goals, what can we do to adapt and change so that we do meet those goals? There's several different examples out there. You can see the city of Dallas is on the right, which is pretty high tech and pretty impressive. But there's a lot of different ways to do this out there and a lot of different goals that we can measure. There's also ways to kind of develop an intersection treatment guide and formalize where we're putting roundabouts, where we're putting, special crossings, that sort of thing, so that all that information is a simple framework to help determine what's the appropriate design based on the goals for the surrounding area. In other words, maybe you don't have to go through the communication every time of why a roundabout is appropriate for this place or why it's not, and then we can just kind of point to the goals and say, we've determined already that this is a good area for a roundabout. It's not a good area. It's a good area for maybe a raised crossing or a hawk signal, that sort of thing. There's also ways to get more out of your maintenance dollars. So we know that a huge portion of the budget of every city, including Fargo, is just routine maintenance, right? Resurfacings, pavement preservation. Reconstructions and restripings are great opportunities to advance simple projects and make sure that no opportunity is wasted. So in other words, if we're already tearing up the street to fix a water main under it, then maybe there's a way to, maybe we don't have to put the street back exactly as it was. It's already torn up. We already have to restripe. Should we be doing a road diet on the street? Should we be adding bike lanes? Simple things that we can do because we have the opportunity and that we're there. Another one is to develop a formal project prioritization process. In other words, determine a data-driven way to evaluate proposed projects and determine whether they're a good fit for the city, whether they're going to meet our goals. This also ties in with federal funding because, as we all know, not sure when, we've been tracking it for a while now, but there's going to be a big federal infrastructure package at some point, right? It's going to put a lot more money on the table. Having a project prioritization process is something that helps a lot of communities. You can say, look, we've evaluated these projects based on these goals, and some good goals are the official federal funding priority goals, which are safety, innovation, equity, environmental justice. Should look familiar. A lot of them are also the goals for this plan. Here's why they're a good candidate for federal funding. Having a data-driven process is a good way to make sure that you're making use and able to go for all those funding opportunities, as well as just a good transparent process to show the city, look, to show the people, hey, we evaluate all our projects based on these metrics. These are the ones that floated to the top as the best ideas. And then another one that we might want to consider is evaluating our spending priorities. The graph on the right was actually a analysis done by MetroCog for the last MTP, the last Metropolitan Transportation Plan, of how Fargo has spent its transportation funding over the last 6 years. And as you can see, a lot of it's new development, about 50% of it is new development, so new streets that are coming in. And the other biggest category is street reconstructions. These represent a huge opportunity. That's about 70% of our funding right there. That if we can kind of shift the way we're thinking about these and set up a new framework, that presents about 70% of our funding opportunities that could be going towards a new multimodal type of framework. It also gives us the potential to balance the spending on capacity expansion and innovative projects. So for instance, do we need to take another look at it and decide if we should be spending as much money on our capacity projects? The other category you'll notice is missing up there is there's not a dedicated category right now for multimodal projects. And should we be reconsidering this? I don't have answers to these questions. These are kind of questions for you and city staff to consider, but I think it's a good process every once in a while to take a look at where our money has been going over the last 5 or 10 years, and do we want it to go the same places over the next decade? So that's all we have for formal presentation. Like Jeremy said, we do have some kind of official keypad polling questions if you want to do those. I was planning on there being, more than 4 people. It might be a little too formal for this small group, and happy to just kind of have a discussion, or we could walk through some of the questions that we have.
Could you go back one slide, please?
Yes, absolutely.
When you say local 8%, local match, is that city match, state match?
That, I believe, is city match that goes towards, someone in the city may have more information, but I believe that's city match that goes towards federal and state projects.
Do you know, Jeremy?
I don't know.
We can also get back to you on that if we don't want to give false information right now.
You showed your priorities for the DOT from the state and all that. When you've got this 8% on, is that all the city has to put in, or do we have to put in more?
No, we have to put in quite a bit more than that.
I was getting pretty happy here for a minute.
No, so I should quote that's 8% of the total spending that Fargo typically projects that are federally or state funded have at least a 20% match that the city has to put in.
Yeah, I can get back to the group too. MetroCog put this together based upon, some of the ways that it designates where how money is spent in the region, and I forget that exactly what that local match characteristic was.
It's just that we have a sales tax where we have streets on there, we have different monies from utilities. So I'm just trying to figure out, I was under the impression, even with the state project, we oftentimes are putting quite a bit of the local in.
Yeah, and this might be, I know that we were working with Jeremy to aggregate some of the city data for local money, and we weren't necessarily able to get all of that information. And so I would say the majority of this reporting is federal money that flows through MetroCog.
So Jeremy, on 32nd Avenue, when they did that part they've already done, a huge part of that was federal, isn't it? Because we didn't have to special it as much as we thought for the locals.
Yeah, typically on our federal projects, though, I mean, they say 80-20, but it ends up being 50 or 60-40. It's sometimes as bad as 50-50. It all depends upon what the surrounding land use is.
And maybe just a slight note to this funding pie chart here does not include the Transportation Alternatives Program, which is a dedicated funding source from the federal government for bicycle and pedestrian projects. This just looks at what we call our, it's the surface or STP, Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. Sorry, the name changed a couple of years ago. MetroCog is looking at flexing those funds. They're flexible. You can spend them on transit and roadways and bicycle and pedestrian projects and a whole host of other things. And one of the goals of our MTP is to flex that for multimodal purposes. Currently, MetroCog works with MapBus to fund some capital bus purchases, either every year, every other year. And we're also looking at putting together flexing that project or that funding source for other multimodal transportation projects in the region.
Go ahead, Dave.
So, Mr. Chair, Mike, since you're up here, will you talk a little bit about how the changes that are coming with the MetroCog? And I do think that we'll have more determination of our own versus in the past, the NDDOT, we would have a recommended list and they would choose which one. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. As we transition, well, I shouldn't say as we transition, we're past the 2020 census. We've officially gone over the 200,000 population density barrier, except because of the delay with COVID-19, the Census Bureau has delayed their urban area boundary designation, and so that will occur sometime next year, which will formalize us as a transportation management area, which is the second tier of the MPO structure, where we have more autonomy as a region to pick our transportation projects. Like Commissioner Pepcorn noted, right now we put together a list of projects from our region on the North Dakota side and on the Minnesota side that ultimately goes to North Dakota DOT to make a decision on which projects will become funded. In the future, we will have that luxury to pick and choose which projects that we think will be funded. And with that, we'll have a dedicated funding source from the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. It's estimated right now that to be about $12.5 million a year for the North Dakota side, which is not necessarily, sometimes we are below that and sometimes we are above that. I would say we average over a 10-year period probably at around there. But we will be able to basically choose where that money gets programmed for our region. And of course, with that though, we take over responsibility for maintenance of some of the roadways in our area. We have to make sure that we're keeping our system in a state of good repair.
Mr. Preston.
Yeah, when I can't remember all the plans that you'd listed initially, but one of the things that I don't think I saw on there was a long-range plan. And I think the intent with the one that was written, I don't know, 2009, 2011, something like that, was to define a neighborhood based on kind of a centralized collecting point for the neighborhood, but being able to walk around the neighborhood and get some small kind of amenities like a carton of milk, that kind of thing. So I guess I'm wondering, and we are going to embark also on developing or writing a plan, how those concepts come into, when you're talking 49% of the dollars are going into new construction, it seems like it would be really smart to me constructing those streets based on that concept of neighborhoods.
Yeah, and just for clarity, are you talking about the Go 2030 plan or?
No, I'm talking, Nicole, am I calling them the right thing? I get the names mixed up.
No, thanks for the question. The 2007 growth plan, and
Growth
so
plan.
which
There we go.
is the step prior to the comprehensive plan. So I think I'd like to suggest we go to your questions before we, this is really an opportunity for workshopping and getting some feedback from you. I know there's still questions to answer, and if we need to do other feedback questions, but wanted to kind of suggest, since we have about 15 minutes left.
Yeah.
It all ties together, Commissioner Preston, in terms of your questions as your workshopping questions.
Great. All right, so I'm gonna go through these, and like I said, we do have if you want to be a little high tech and use your smartphone to kind of go to this website, and we would be able to see the results on the screen. Otherwise, if everyone wants to just forego this step, we can just kind of talk through some of the questions. Should we just do that? Okay.
Let's talk through the
All right, and
questions.
since we only have 15 minutes, I'm going to speed through some of these that are not as important. And then, okay, so we talked about, and let's just kind of have a conversation here. We put together 6 goals for this project, which could be used to evaluate future transportation projects. So like we talked about putting together kind of a data-driven methodology and ways to measure each transportation project against these goals. Are there goals up there that this group thinks are, more important, that we should absolutely be measuring projects based on? And maybe goals that are less important that we don't need to think about as much? But what should we be thinking about as we look at future transportation projects?
Well, I'll throw in a question, an answer that is connected to one of my questions, and that's with every one of these approaches. In my head, winter snow weather management is just a game changer in some of these suggestions or not. you know, if you have, anyway, we don't need to explain the impact of having roads you can't see the surface
Yeah.
in winter, or all the other conditions that come from winter. So how, in my mind, you know, that has to fit in here. I'm sure it does.
That's was part of the thinking for this goal of life cycle sustainability in here. In other words, not putting together street designs that, you know, we can't maintain, that we can't plow. That just doesn't make any sense, right? And it's something we've been talking to Public Works a lot about because it's, I mean, we're from the Twin Cities. Fargo's one step even beyond that in terms of plowing and maintenance and that sort of thing. So it's definitely a consideration.
So I can chime in with my three top. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Safety being number one, and beyond vehicular safety, but also projecting into the future. Complete streets, and innovation, depending on what you're talking about there, but innovative ways to meet those other goals.
Sure, okay.
Mr. Pipcorn, you got 3?
I don't know if I have 3, but I think safety, I think that's the number one for me. And I do the life cycle sustainability. I didn't know that's what winter was, so I learned something new today, so I appreciate that. To me, that's my top 2. And I do think innovation, I think we like to be able to think we're a little bit on the cutting edge, and so, but I think the other thing is, I think it's great that we're all here planning. When you talk about maintenance, there's all those things, everybody has to work together, and so and I do think we're good at that, and so I think I don't know if that makes sense. Thank you.
John, you got 3?
I would say safety, sustainability, and innovation.
Okay.
I'm going to say innovation, complete streets, and life cycle sustainability. I'm assuming safety is in all your designs. I would just presume that. But I think we have to be innovative. Complete streets for the commission is really important. What are we designing for different parts of the city? And then we like to extend our life cycle as long as possible.
Okay, all right, that's really good to know. And yeah, all these goals are important, but sometimes, you know, some of them get a little bit more weight depending on where we're looking. So it's really good to know kind of what's most important. And then kind of going back to this idea of setting up a way to track and measure how we're doing on transportation. And you don't have to limit yourself to these options on the screen, but are there things that this group thinks the city should be tracking and measuring to keep track of how we're doing on our transportation goals? And I can explain any of those up there if anybody needs kind of a primer.
Well, we always get graded on walkability. I think that's important to have in there. I like safety crash rates because we don't always know that. It's important to know that. And then I think it'd be interesting because we always lose sight of this is how many miles of sidewalk or bike facilities. That would be my 3.
So, Mr. Chair, I just want to add real quick that I don't see any talk about how much this costs. And to me, that's a concern. There's lots of really nice ideas, but like the return on investment, we're starting to look at that with when you build a new section of town, I would like to see how much these things cost compared to a standard roadway.
Okay.
Anyway, so I do think that's important. Thank you.
So sort of a return on investment or kind of benefit cost ratio type of thing to track? Okay.
For the 3 that I would see, safety being number 1, walkability number 2, and probably connectivity.
Okay.
I don't know how you'd measure that, but yeah.
I will say safety, land use mix, and connectivity.
Okay.
Dave, you got 3? Do you have 3?
To me, that was the one thing, the other thing, there seems to be a focus that bike facilities are separate than streets, and I don't accept that concept. All of our streets, bikes are allowed to travel on them, and actually, I believe they're more safe to be on the street than on a bike lane. That's just my perspective, and so I do think we should start looking at that to have that be an option. So that's just, and the legislature doesn't agree with me. They know they allow them to not follow the traffic rules, but that's a different topic, and I won't have you comment on that.
Okay. So the next question was just anything else that is key to track. You already hit on this with kind of a return on investment or benefit cost. Did anybody else have one that you didn't see up there that you really want to make sure the city is looking at or measuring?
I think part of us wants to know as a commission, when we talk about innovative as a community, I think Darlette mentioned it compared to other cities, because sometimes we get talked about, right, Jeremy, whether we're walkable or bikeable or what are we? And we know the new kids coming up, just look at a poll somewhere and see where you rank as a city. So it's a curiosity of where we need to head, because we think we know now that people choose where they want to live and then they find a job. So we'll be ranked by some national metrics. I just think as a commission, we have to know what you think, where's the world headed? And are we at least halfway there, or partially there, or way ahead, or whatever?
Yeah.
I remember when we first started using bikes in town, we were the #1 city in the nation for use of the bikes. Well, that seems to have faded now, doesn't it, Dave? I don't see we have as much bicycle use, but just what are the trends and where do we need to be going?
Okay.
Just real quick, the other thing I would like us to, there's other cities that have very similar environment that we do. And to me, that's, like Minneapolis is fairly close, but cities our size, what are they doing? But also not Tampa, because we're not Tampa, but cities that have winter, but they also are doing some of these things. That's what I would like us to copy, the good ideas that they're doing in other parts of but like Dallas, you show Dallas, that's wonderful, but for 3 or 4 months out of the year, we're not Dallas. And so that's the one thing. But however, there are cities like us that are doing things that we can copy. That's what I like doing. So thank you.
And I think innovative means, it can mean a lot of different things. It could mean an innovative policy for snow removal that prioritizes bikes and peds. I think that Minneapolis passed an ordinance that they will brush the bike lanes first, and then they'll go after the roadways or the vehicular roadways. So I think that's innovation. It could be innovation in terms of access to all sorts of transportation. Is it like a mobility hub in terms of, how is that signed? How is that, how are these things marketed to residents in terms of accessibility? So
Just one more thing, that cut, I have a son in a wheelchair, and so accessibility isn't just bicycles. And so I see cars and bikes and pedestrians, but to give you an example, when we get snow on Broadway and get the ridge built up along the sidewalk, that's no longer accessible to people in wheelchairs. And so to me, then you're closed off for 3 or 4 months. So I do think I would like that included someplace in this, and maybe that doesn't exactly what you're fitting into, but I do, and we have talked about that, but I do think that's an important thing that we include. Thanks.
I'll join in too. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jeremy.
I was going to say, that's a great point. I mean, innovative winter maintenance that like what's the prioritization level, and that could be a policy that's related to transportation or anything like that. I think that innovation can kind of weave its way into connectivity even. Is there a stance on connectivity that's innovative, that weaves in, winter maintenance, things like that?
Thank you for bringing that point up, Commissioner Pepcorn. That's a personal one to you, but it's an important one to everybody in the community. And we need to not forget the accessibility issue. Some question marks I'll raise, and it's just question marks because I don't want us to get way down the road and realize we didn't address these topics that are getting more contemporary. For example, golf carts. There's communities that are wanting and using, seniors and others using golf carts, mopeds, electric bikes, scooters, Lime bikes, skateboards. I don't want us to not anticipate that we have a whole population of people using skateboards, and how can you plan it so it's safe and accessible for them too? And snowmobiles. So these are topics that have bubbled up or will bubble up and have in other places and do here. So however we can not overlook those topics going forward, be great.
Yeah, that's a great point. We can definitely look for, and it's not, a Fargo specific thing, right? All cities are kind of grappling with how do we treat some of these vehicles and everything. But there's probably, snowmobiles is a new one to me. So there's probably kind of a Fargo specific way to kind of deal with some of that. But yeah, we can definitely look at that, this plan. All right. And then there's just this question of, and like we said, there's a lot of kind of problems with this graph in terms of what we found out about the data and how this was put together. But just the question of, when you're looking at this graph, what's your gut feeling in terms of, are there categories that maybe should increase or decrease? Are there additional categories that we should be funding? something you don't see up there, that sort of thing.
The difficulty when you ask us this question is we rely on our engineering department to kind of lead us in this and go to the maximum needs within the city. And when you have this new development, that's just we're having growth, so you're going to be in the new development. I can't necessarily slow that down. We could change some of our money into reconstruction and those types of things. But again, typically the engineering department looks at the budget for the year and figures out an equitable way of doing that. So if you want me to criticize the department, I could, but I
No,
really
I-
don't know which one I'd ask them to do.
If I could jump in here, the good news is I've been here long enough to know how we do things and how things could be improved. Like on this list, and I've been thinking about this just quite a bit, we really don't set aside money for pedestrian improvements, path improvements, other than the federal transportation alternatives grants, which is really a small amount of money on an annual basis. So there, with going to the TMA and being able to use our federal funds in a different way, I mean, we could put millions of dollars in ped improvements to be the head of the list, priority first. So, I mean, that's one thing to think about as to how we could change. Typically, we've replaced our roads reconstruction on capacity expansion, or if the water and road is falling apart. Those are the first two things. Does it need to be bigger for capacity? And is it falling apart? We really have never said, well, it's awful for pedestrians, it's awful for bikes. That's what we're working to right now. So I think this discussion's great. If I could put a bow on this, since we're almost at the hour, the good thing is that what they've been talking about and what you guys have been talking about, we've been doing this within City Hall for years and years, probably just not very present in how some of the decisions are made. Everything's context sensitive. What everybody wants to think about Main Avenue and how great of a project that was. We reduced the lanes, focused more on the sidewalks, threw in a beautiful roundabout. But even before those days, we shrunk 4th Street. Remember 4th Street down here used to be 4 lanes. Now it's 3 lanes with bike lanes. 2nd Street along the river, that used to be 5 lanes right outside here. Now it's 3, and it probably could just be 2. And if you do a cross section on 2nd Street here, there's 4 paths. There's a path on the east side, west side, and then there's 2 by the lift station. So we've been doing quite a bit of this. I think to get us to hire a consultant to help us out, to get us to the point where we're in front of you talking about transportation as a whole, I think it's great.
And I should just say, I was just going to jump in just to say, I should have said this at the beginning, but credit where credit's due. Jeremy's right. And a lot of these recommendations, things we're putting in front of you, are things that the city already does. And we just need to formalize and put it in an actual document that we can adopt and say, these are official policies.
And so we do grow. We've been growing quite a bit, but we're not growing to the point where we can't turn our face on the built environment. So we've done a lot of the low-hanging fruits, retrofitting things, with the current roadway, 10th and University. We shrunk it and put bike lanes on. But we've got a great pedestrian facility along the river, but getting to the river from all parts of town is pretty difficult. 40th Avenue South is fairly decent, but if you get into the older part of town, 17th Avenue, 13th Avenue, even 5th Avenue South, it's difficult if you're on a bicycle to get to the river system. So the low-hanging fruits are pretty much picked, and now we're going to have to do some construction projects to improve the multimodal level of service.
Jeremy, let me just throw one quick little interjection in here. Yes, we do have these bikes and accesses and trails along rivers, but another thing we don't really track is when they're accessible. If they're shut down at dusk, like a lot of them are, you can't, or off seasons, you can't use them. So I think we need to also track the availability, usability of them all 24/7,
Okay.
or see how we can improve access and use of them.
You're talking more just like temporally versus conditions on the paths?
Yeah, like you can't go down to the bike trails and through the parks after dusk.
Okay.
So we might track them and say we have these bike trails, but doesn't mean you can use them all the time. That's just a minor point, but.
And if I could just add one thing there, we're talking recreational bike use, but we're also talking about bike use for commuting. And, the trails are great for recreational, not for commuting.
That's right. They're two things that sometimes go together and sometimes are different types and locations of facilities. So
Yep.
good to keep in mind.
And the last thing I would say is innovation. I'm glad you all basically picked innovation. We used to just be streets, stop signs, and signals. If it didn't work, well, let's add more lanes. Roundabouts, we first put those in probably 15 years ago. Through trials and tribulations and public works having to pull out some front end loaders, getting stuck in a roundabout. We've made them happy. We've made them bigger. In Moorhead, they got the diverging diming at 8th Street and 94. It's phenomenal stuff. So innovation keeps coming. The one thing we do have to think about, I'm glad somebody said innovation with snow removal. If we're going to get protected bike lanes, the snow removal is going to have to be very innovative as well. I know that wind blows sideways here, and it's really something in the winter. So innovation, how do we rebuild the built environment? That's really where we're at.
Commissioner Pipcorn?
So, Mr. Chairman, Jeremy threw out a challenge on the email that he sent to the commissioners.
That's right.
And Lord knows I don't need any more Halloween candy, but he asked what a Hawk system was. It's a high-intensity activated crosswalk. Is that correct, Jeremy?
Oh, my God.
I will accept the applause. I will not accept any more Halloween candy, so thank you for that.
Did you Google it?
I'm on the MetroCog, so Mike made
Yeah.
sure that I knew it a long time ago.
Gotcha.
He has all
So-
the acronyms, and we have to know them all, and we are tested on them. So.
Brian, if you're listening, can you switch the screens here? Yeah, it's the most, it's the crazy. I think it's good. Good politicians put this together. So you can make Hawk out of high intensity activated crosswalk on the right side
Oh,
there.
that's where you get the HAWK.
Well,
I was wondering about that.
it comes from AASHTO on the federal scale. So with that, I think I'm satisfied with this discussion. I think it's been great information from our consultants. So, and let's keep this going. I think and they're going to keep it going, obviously. But don't be bashful to ask us questions and how we process things.
Jeremy, just as a question, is the only Hawk system we have in this area over at Concordia? Is that a Hawk there?
Yeah, that's a Hawk. No, I think we've got 4 or 5 of them in town. So straight north of the Fargo Dome, going over to Buffalo Wild Wings, that's
Yep.
one. There's one in your neck of the woods, right by Centennial School, 40th Avenue and
Yep.
28th Street. So I think we've got 5 of them, maybe.
Very good. Thank you very much. You guys did a great job of presenting this, and we're looking forward to additional good work. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.